Good evening and welcome to the Kuhn Academy for our possibly final installment of Term 1, AP US History. I sure hope you're watching because tomorrow's discussion is going to be very difficult if you're not. All right, so we're talking about Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. All right, now most of you have been to the Lincoln Memorial and you've seen this famous image. What is kind of most known for Abraham Lincoln is the Emancipation Proclamation and his decision to free the slaves during the Civil War. Okay, what I want to make sure we know, because this is a perception we have to clear up from your grade school days, is that Lincoln was not an abolitionist. All right, and Lincoln did not have the intent of freeing the slaves when he was elected. Southerners perceived that to be his goal. Okay, but that is not what he stated, nor was that any of his position as he ran. Okay, the war begins in April of 1861, as you've already read in the text. And the Emancipation is going to be issued January 1st, 1863, roughly the halfway point of the war. Okay, and it's credited to Abraham Lincoln. Okay, now Lincoln, prior to this, at the start of the Civil War, said, "My paramount objective in a struggle is to save the Union." All right, he said, "If I could do that freeing all of the slaves, I would. If I could do it freeing none of the slaves, I would. And if I could do it freeing some of the slaves, I would." Okay. Lincoln chose that third option and did free some of the slaves. So that's another misnomer we have to clear up, is that the Emancipation Proclamation did not free all of the slaves. It only freed a select amount, which we'll get into in a little bit. Okay? All right. Now, who would support the Emancipation Proclamation? Your abolitionists would support it, obviously, okay, because they've been pushing for emancipation forever. And then your border states are going to be the ones to oppose it. Okay, those border states are Missouri, Kentucky. All right, West Virginia is going to spring about in a little bit. Delaware, Maryland, okay, are your border states. Missouri, Kentucky are the two big ones, though, okay, because they are in the Union but still slave-owning states. Okay, so any decision Lincoln makes to free the slaves is going to affect their support for the Civil War. Okay, now this man here, General Benjamin Butler, nicknamed the Beast, you can kind of tell by that picture why he's the Beast, is the beginning architect of emancipation. We can kind of trace its origins back to him. Okay, he's a general in the Union Army around the First Battle of Bull Run, which is the first battle of the war that was a disastrous defeat for the Union, as they expected the war to be over in 90 days, march right in, capture Virginia, and have it be over. However, they were destroyed here, and it kind of convinced people there'd be a long war. Butler argued that slaves should be considered contraband, okay? And it kind of changed the definition of what a freed slave is. Okay, contraband by definition is captured property during wartime. So if I'm marching through Virginia and I come across a field of cattle, I can seize those cattle as contraband, and that's now part of the Union Army. Okay. Now, what was happening was at the start of the war, or before the shots were even fired, a lot of slaves were escaping Southern armies because the Southern Army used them for manual labor. They were slaves. They were escaping from there into Union camps. Now, the Union generals, their job is to preserve the Union. What document does the Union stand for? The Constitution. All right. Now, what does the Constitution say a runaway slave should do? It should be returned to its owner, okay, according to the Fugitive Slave Law. Contraband, by the way, would be a great word for the word wall on Tuesday morning, but I will not be here to give Taylor the bonus points. But I hope to see it on Wednesday when I come to class, okay? If I don't, I'm going to know nobody watched this. All right, so they were returning the slaves to the South. Well, Butler comes in and says, wait a minute, this is stupid. We are helping them by returning them more manual labor, because every slave doing work in the Southern Army is one more white guy that can shoot and kill us. Okay, so he says, let's start taking them, seizing them as property, and then this is going to hurt the Southern cause. Now, his real goal was to free slaves, obviously, but he was using it as a military argument. All right, this is what's called the chamber pot with Benjamin Butler's face on it. If you don't know what a chamber pot is, look it up. You'll find the laughter and the humor of this. This has more to do with something that happens in New Orleans rather than emancipation. Okay, so Benjamin Butler chamber pot. All right, so now that slaves are being considered contraband, you start to see a lot of fugitive slaves, a lot of slaves fleeing into Union camps, okay, in the hopes that, hey, these guys will take me in. They're not fighting to enslave me. They're just fighting to keep the Union together. Maybe I got a better chance of freedom if I get into their army. So more and more slaves are entering the Union Army just as contraband, though, which is no different than them being in the South, except they're not treated as a slave. All right? This leads for Congress to pass the first Confiscation Act. Okay? By the way, these laws I'm about to give you are definitely things that would look great on a final exam essay. Hint, hint, wink, wink. All right, so the first Confiscation Act is basically Congress saying that any slave owner whose slaves were used to aid the rebellion, all right, so if I live in Georgia and I gave my slaves to the Confederate Army, okay, to basically help them with ditch digging and cooking and so on, I would lose rights to those slaves, all right? So a slave owner who helped the rebellion lost all rights to those slaves, okay? The problem was any law passed by Congress needs to be enforced, and Union generals were not enforcing this because most Union generals were racist and some were even pro-slavery. Okay, like what General Sherman, for example. McClellan was kind of a thorn in Lincoln's side throughout most of the war. Pardon me. McClellan hated Lincoln and did not want to see slaves freed, so he chose not to enforce this policy either. Okay, but what is significant here is slaves are running away and Congress is taking action. Okay. Now, the reason we call it the first Confiscation Act is because there will be a second Confiscation Act. All right. Now, this says any slave owner who supports the rebellion loses their slaves forever. Okay. But again, this is an act of Congress. There's no teeth in this. There's no law enforcing them to do it. I mean, the law forces them to do it, but if they choose not to enforce it, there's no repercussions. Okay. So the two Confiscation Acts are Congress's step toward freeing slaves. Essentially, any slave owner who's in the Army, because he's aiding the rebellion, he now loses his slaves. All right? Which takes us to the Militia Act. Okay? This allowed blacks to be in the Army, all right, but only for manual labor and for dirty digging work and things like that. Okay? But it did cause more slaves to escape because they said, hey, I can support this country that's, at least not fighting to keep me enslaved, and starts to tip the balance toward the North because the North is getting even more manpower than they already had. Okay? So Militia Act lets them now come into the Army voluntarily, of course. They can't be forced to serve or drafted or anything like that. And they start to get in there. Now, there's a great movie called Glory about blacks in the war. You can watch the whole thing on YouTube, I think, and it's a really good educational tool. If we had time, we would watch that. But there's a lot to be learned from seeing that about black soldiers. We'll talk more about that later. Okay, so Lincoln basically decides that he is going to free the slaves. So on September 22nd, 1862, this is after a couple of disastrous defeats for the Army. They've lost the Battle of Bull Run, they lose the Battle of 7 Days, and things aren't going well at all. Lincoln says, I have to change the course of the war. So he decides he's going to free the slaves. However, he's worried that if he does it too soon, he's going to look desperate. Like he's only freeing the slaves to help try and win the war and no other reason. Okay, so he says, once we get a victory, once I get a military victory on a battlefield, then I'm going to issue this proclamation to free the slaves. That victory was the Battle of Antietam up in Maryland. This is the first battle in northern soil. Maryland was a border state. They technically was in the northern soil. The Union Army drives the Confederates back into Virginia. That battle's technically considered a tie, but nonetheless, it's the victory Lincoln needs to issue his Emancipation Proclamation. Antietam also is the bloodiest single day in American history. That probably won't make the exam, but the Emancipation definitely will. Okay, so what does the Emancipation Proclamation do? All right, it's submitted September 22nd, 1862. That's 5 days after Antietam. Okay, so this is a result of that battle. So this is kind of a cause-effect thing. Okay, now what you need to remember is that Lincoln had been planning to do this for a while. He had seen these slaves escaping. He'd seen them running away. Something he was committed to. Okay, it freed all slaves in areas in rebellion. Okay, meaning it did not free slaves in Maryland, Kentucky, or Missouri, or any areas that were already reconquered by the Union Army, like the coast of Virginia or the coast of South Carolina. Only slaves in areas that were in rebellion against the United States were freed. Now you might ask, well, then really nobody was freed by this, because if the Union had no control over that area, how could they be freed? In Lincoln's eyes, the Union did have control over it because he was president of the entire United States. These people were in rebellion. They were not a separate country. They were just in rebellion against the United States. So Lincoln still technically was president of Texas and Louisiana and Arkansas and so on. So all slaves in those areas were forever free, was what he said. did not free slaves in border states, did not free slaves in areas of Union control. Now, if you've seen the movie Lincoln, which you should see, all right, he talks about the importance of the 13th Amendment, which is passed at the end of the Civil War in January of 1865. And the reason he wanted the 13th Amendment passed was he was unsure how the emancipation would be done after the war. Because what the emancipation is an executive order by the president telling the military to free all the slaves. All right, it's not an act of Congress. It's just a decision by the president to free the slaves. So he was worried that after the war that might not be constitutional because there's no longer a war anymore. Would he still have the power to free all the slaves? So he pushes for the 13th Amendment in 1865. The emancipation goes into effect January 1st, 1863. We talked about that at the beginning. Okay. More importantly, why did Lincoln do this? Okay, there's three main reasons we're going to come up with. All right, number one, the slaves were escaping. They kind of forced his hand. By coming into these camps, it put the issue on his lap and made him deal with it. Number two, the military situation was poor. We were losing battles. I know in your book you're reading about some battles out west in Tennessee that the Union was winning, but nobody was paying attention to that. The goal of capturing Richmond was first and foremost the most important goal of the Union. Okay, so this poor military situation would maybe up the stakes here a little bit and give the Union something to fight for. And finally, this would isolate France and Britain. Britain and France are never going to support a confederacy that was pro-slavery. Okay, but when they're just fighting for independence, France would help out because they would love to see America divided. But once Lincoln frees the slaves, Britain and France can never join in and support the South. All right, finally, provision of the Emancipation that's also mentioned at the end of that is that it was going to allow blacks to serve in the military. Okay, Frederick Douglass pushed for it. Okay, and he felt that if blacks could serve as soldiers, they could prove their worthiness of being citizens and get some recognition by the government as well. So Emancipation freed the slaves and then put them into the military. By the end of the war, they account for about 10% of all the soldiers in the Union Army. So clearly a big factor in helping earn victory. And the most significant regiment to know about, Foner's going to talk about this, and the movie Glory is focused on what's known as the 54th Massachusetts, the first all-black regiment to see combat down in South Carolina. Okay, so you're going to be talking in class about how important this document was and whether or not it was a worthy accomplishment by Lincoln or whether or not it was a kind of unnecessary wartime measure that really doesn't deserve any credit to Lincoln. All right, so thank you so much for listening, all right, to the Kuhn Academy, where we are not just learning history, we're making history. Have a great day. We'll see you on Wednesday.
Still got a lot of ground that ain't covered yet. There's at least another 1,000,000 miles under these old bus tracks.